Kelly, and thank you, Michelle. And good that as imperfect people that are, I've said before repeatedly, we're a bunch of screw-ups, that while we are not perfect, we are perfectly loved. That's a great thought. Let me just say, first of all, it's good to be back with you, and thank you to Jamie for covering the bases while I was gone. And it is so nice to leave town and not give any thought to anything. And so I'm so grateful for his leadership here and for the pleasure and the privilege and the honor of working alongside him. And so, and much to Elsie's dismay, I am back today. And so, anyway, like I said, this past week we were at the beach with some longtime friends, and while we were down there, we're sitting in this house, and one of the friends that's there with us, her name is Beth, she looks over and she asks me this question. She says, "What kind of shoes are you wearing?" And how she asked the question, I noticed a twinge of disdain. So, "What kind of shoes are you wearing?" And I said, "They're SAS shoes." They're old man shoes, and I don't care. And she said, "I thought they kind of looked old manish." Now, here's the thing. I am 48 years old, and I know that 48 is not 98, but I also know this, it's not 28. And there are some things that are different now than they used to be. For example, my hair is a distant memory. It's been a long time since it was on top of my head. All right, so my hair is a distant memory. I can't read a menu now without glasses. And all that arm stretching stuff that I've watched my grandparents and everybody else do beforehand, now I understand why it is the case. And when you get it where you can see it, then it's so far out you can't see it. Anyway, so there's that experience. The other thing is that about 5 years ago, I had a spinal fusion, and because of that, it has left me, especially if I stand in place for any period of time, I get so stiff, and it's almost like my legs lock up, and so actually like moving around up here helps me. And so if I am standing, though, I have discovered that the longer I stand, the more benefit it is to have some shoes that are really comfortable. And it was because of that I discovered SAS shoes. Now, I guess discovered's a misnomer, because I didn't actually discover them, because my grandmothers, both of them loved SAS shoes. And I knew that, but I went to the store to get something that I felt like I could stand in. And I'm at this point, though, I care less what they look like, entirely less what they look like. In fact, I really think that my next stage in life is a fanny pack and Velcro shoes. I'm trying to set achievable goals. But it is the case that as you age, as you get into these different seasons, there are some perspectives that you begin to have, some things that you begin to think that are true of you that are different than when they were when you were younger. And so, for example, one of the things that I am discovering, that many of you already have discovered, is that function matters more than fashion. And I don't really care whether it looks good on my foot. It matters to me if it feels good on my foot. And that's one of the perspectives that you begin to have, or some of the things that you're prone or subject to start thinking as you age and as you advance through the stages and the seasons of life. That's not just true as it relates to our biological bodies and our physical lives, but it's also true for us as we are advancing in the stages and the seasons of our spiritual life. What I mean by that is this. The longer that you have lived, the more it is that there are some thoughts or some perspectives that you're subject or susceptible to be thinking. It's also true, spiritually speaking, the longer it is that you have lived as a follower of Jesus, as you advance into a season of mature living as a follower of Jesus, there are also some thoughts that you are susceptible to be thinking, and not all of them are positive. Now, we're thinking about this as part of an ongoing series that we're nearing the end of, looking at the life of Moses, but we're thinking about it as he is going through the stages and the seasons of life, and thinking not only about the stages of our own physical lives, but the stages of our spiritual lives as well. And here's the reality. You don't have to be a senior adult to be someone who has followed the Lord for a long time. Some of you came to know Christ at an early age, and you have been following him for decades, even though you're still years away from being able to apply for Social Security. So regardless of your age, it is possible that with respect to stage, as a follower of Christ, there are some conditions that you are susceptible and prone maybe to experiencing that are not helpful. But what are those? That's what we're thinking about today. What are some things that you are susceptible to the longer it is that you are a follower of the Lord? What challenges am I susceptible to the longer that I walk with the Lord? We see, I believe, the answer to that in Numbers chapter 20. If you would look with me in your Bibles there today, Numbers chapter 20, starting with verse 1. There we read, the entire Israelite community entered the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and they settled in Kadesh. Miriam died and was buried there. Now there was no water for the community, so they assembled against Moses and Aaron. The people quarreled with Moses and said, if only we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why have you brought the Lord's assembly into this wilderness for us and our livestock to die here? Why have you led us from Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It's not a place of grain and figs, vines and pomegranates, and there is no water to drink. Then Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the doorway of the tent of meeting. They fell face down, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord spoke to Moses and said, take the staff and assemble the community. You and your brother Aaron are to speak to the rock while they watch, and it will yield its water. You will bring out water for them from the rock and provide drink for the community and their livestock. So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence just as he had commanded him. And Moses and Aaron summoned the assembly in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, listen, you rebels, must we bring water out of this rock for you? Then Moses raised his hand, struck the rock twice with his staff, so that abundant water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust me to demonstrate my holiness in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this assembly into the land I have given them. Moses and Aaron at this point, though, but specifically Moses, is experiencing something not only advanced in years, but advanced in years in the time spent in his walk with the Lord that tells us what he's prone to be susceptible to is something that I may be as well. And so what are those? Well, I've given them some very medical titles today. And so here's the first one, Aragonia. Look at what I can do. So what does that mean? Well, hopefully it'll make sense as we unpack this. But so that we're on the same page in terms of context, you remember what has been going on at 80 years of age, which is pretty staggering that this occurred at this point. But God speaks to Moses when he's 80 years old and says, listen, I want you to be the one that I used to lead my people out of slavery in Egypt. And you remember he goes toe-to-toe with the Pharaoh. There's the plagues and all that. They come out of Egypt, all of these Hebrews. And where are they headed? They're headed to what we know as the Promised Land. They don't know how to get there, so God is supernaturally guiding them. And you have Moses as their leader, his brother Aaron as the high priest, and they are marching towards the Promised Land that God is leading them to. Once they get to the outskirts of that, we looked at this a few weeks ago, they send spies in, 12 of them. 10 come back and say, man, this place is pretty amazing. However, this place is filled with some giants. These people, compared to us, they're just huge. And we don't stand a chance about going into this land and trying to take it, because they're not going to just say, here, have our little territory. That's not going to happen. But 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, said, listen, God has led us here, and God has said he's going to deliver this into our hands. And yeah, those people are big, but our God's bigger. And if we do what God said, he's going to give us this land. But the people yielded to the majority report, because we all know that God always works by majority rule, right? And so that was not the case. And because of that, God judges them severely. And the punishment, because of their lack of faith, because of their lack of obedience, is that they were going to not go into the Promised Land at that point, but they were going to wander around for 40 years. And during those 4 decades, everyone who's over the age of 20 is going to die. The funeral business was going to be very, very good for 4 decades. We are now near the end of those 4 decades as we get to Numbers 20. That means that Moses is now roughly 120 years old. So 120 years old, this is happening. Near the end of this wilderness experience, Miriam is one who's over 20, and Miriam, Moses' sister, the sister of Aaron, has died. They have buried her in this area known as Kadesh. She's buried there, and as this massive throng of people is there, it is becoming abundantly clear we have a challenge. And the challenge is that we need some water. And there's not lakes and rivers and streams. We need some water. In fact, this area that we call the wilderness, the 40 years of wilderness wandering, we think forest and trees, but in truth, it's dry and arid. It's more desert-like, and that's what they are experiencing. And so, because of that, in verse 2, we're told that the people, they assemble against Moses and Aaron. So that doesn't mean that you have a group of people saying, hey, Moses, we've got a challenge here, but they are assembling against. And they are positioning themselves against Moses and Aaron and against their leadership. And they are quarreling. They're arguing with him, and they're saying some pretty negative things. They're saying, you know what? It would be better if we were part of the massive throng of people that died. You know, over the last 40 years, we've been watching gobs of people die. It'd been better if we were part of that in year 1 and we wouldn't have to be dealing with this misery. And then they say, why have you brought us out here? This is your stinking fault in the first place. We wouldn't be here if you weren't leading us. You're our leader. Look where we are. And we're going to thirst to death? Keep in mind also, these are people who have not themselves experienced slavery. They're all under the age of 20. Yet they are saying things like this. You know what? Maybe it'd be better if we'd go to Egypt and sacrifice our freedom, and maybe we'd go into the pyramid building business. Maybe we can go back in the brick cooking business. Maybe it would be better for us to be slaves. Not surprisingly, Moses and Aaron are exasperated. I mean, in truth, they have been doing what God said. They have been guiding where God guided. They are at this place because this is where God led them to be. And Moses has got to be just thinking, oh, what do I do? And I think that's why he falls face down in the Lord's presence, because it's a physical demonstration of his exasperation. I am spent. I am done with this. I have no idea what to do. We are here because you led us, and they're after me, and I don't know what to say to them. And so God gives some instructions, and the instructions are that he's to take this staff. Now, it doesn't specifically mention this, but it's believed that the staff that's mentioned is what we know as Aaron's rod. This is the same staff, we believe, that God led Moses to strike the Nile River with. This is the same river, the same staff that God caused to miraculously bud. He's to take that staff. He and Aaron are to gather the people. And apparently there is some monumentally large rock that they're going to gather around, get everybody together, and then he says, I want you to speak to the rock, and water's going to be coming out of this rock miraculously. I mean, the word miracle is the only term that fits this. It's not logical, it's not reasonable, it's miraculous. Water will come from this rock, sufficient to supply the needs of the people and their animals. So, having heard these very clear, specific instructions, what does Moses do? We're told in verse 9 that Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as God had commanded him. That's good. So far, so good. Moses and Aaron summoned the assembly in front of the rock. That's good. God told him to do that. But notice his language at the end of verse 10. He says, listen, you rebels. Now, in terms of tone, what do you think that sounded like? Come one, come all. Hear now, little rebels. Do you think it's like that? No, I think Moses is furious. And maybe because he's 120 years old, his voice is kind of raspy. I don't know. But maybe he's got a big booming voice. We have no idea. But I think with everything he's got in his 120-year-old body, he is haranguing these people. Listen here. I mean, he is livid. And he says, listen, you rebels. But notice the question. He says, must we bring water out of this rock for you? Now, I think it's easy to pass over this statement, but in those words in that specific question, I believe there is something very significant that is going on there. Because notice what Moses is doing. He is taking potential credit for a miracle that's getting ready to take place. So you just want me to bring rock? I'm going to do this again. Bunch of rebels, you heathens, pagans, infidels, dunces, anything he could probably call them. So here we are again. So, all right, so this is what I got to do. And now I got to make water come out of a rock for you? It's interesting, though, and it's so easy, I think, to pass over this, but do not do so. Moses, at 120 years old, is doing what? He's certainly thinking of himself to be mighty powerful, isn't he? Does he say, God is going to do this? Does he say, I'm going to go to God on your behalf? God's going to do a miracle? God's going to do something? What is he doing? Me. Am I going to have to do this? Me and my brother here, Daryl, aren't we going to have to do this? Are we going to have to do this for you? He's taking credit for ultimately what would be God's activity. And this is a condition that I'm calling aragonia, which really is nothing more than arrogance. Look at what I can do. Here's the reality. The longer it is that you walk with God, it should be, it could be, it ought to be, the longer that you have walked with Him, you have seen God use you in notable ways, increasing ways over time. That's how it should be, isn't it? I mean, that you come to know the Lord at this point, and as you walk with Him, and the closer that you walk with Him, the more that He uses you. In fact, it should also be true, the longer that you follow Christ, the more you should become what? Christ-like. But here's what you can be susceptible to. Here, and this, if it could happen to Moses, it could happen to me, it could happen to you, it could happen to all of us. The longer it is that we follow the Lord in the winter seasons of life or in the mature seasons of our walk with the Lord, we can get to the point where we misappropriate what God does for what we are able to do. We've seen God work through us so many times. We've seen Him use us so many times. We begin to think, look at what I can do. This is a tool that I've got in my tool belt. This is a skill that I have. And what has happened is that we've been walking with the Lord so long that we've seen Him work so many times that we kind of forget that was Him doing this. That's God at work. And we are beginning to take our availability in God's hand and mistake it for our ability without God's hand. Moses is 120 years old, and he's been walking with God for a long, long time. God has used him in amazing and significant ways. You got the plagues, the parting of the Red Sea. Time and time, he goes up on the mountain and God etches the commandments onto tablets of stone. So many things that God has been able to use him as part of accomplishing. And I think it begins to have an effect on him, but not for all the right reasons. It produces some arrogance. Look at what I can do. The church that I served in Charlotte did something that many churches have done, and that was that they produced a cookbook. And that whole experience of producing a cookbook led me to discover that that whole experience can be summarized with one word. You ready? Plagiarism. Plagiarism. And when a church puts together a cookbook, that's where everybody in the church finds a recipe that they like, and they put their name on it, and they submit it. And so the church cookbook then has your recipes that you stole from somebody behind a curtain somewhere wrote all of them. I don't think there's any new recipes. They're just, and we just keep passing them on. This was Grandma's. Well, Grandma stole it from somebody else. Anyway, so I discovered that in the process, and I thought, well, if you can't beat them, join them. And so that cookbook has a couple of recipes in there that have my name on it. There's a chicken marsala recipe. Excellent. Found it on the internet. It's a copycat of Olive Gardens. It's delicious. There's a banana cream pie recipe in there. It's delicious. Every time. It's a 10. I promise you. It's delicious. And it's entirely possible that there are those that have opened that cookbook maybe even recently. Perhaps someone that picked up on this cookbook and said, Michael Owens, that might be decent. Chicken marsala is pretty good. We had it with that banana cream pie. That Michael, he's a pretty good cook. But you know what all Michael was? Michael was somebody that was pretty good at following instructions. That's all I did. And I followed those instructions, and if I point you to those same instructions, if you do those, you will get a good result. But what's easy and what can happen is that I take that and assume that, put that onto myself, project it onto myself. This is what I have done. This is what I can do. And I'm telling you, it is so easy, and it happens subtly, it happens over time. The longer it is that you walk with the Lord, the longer it is that you try to take seriously His commands and His expectations and His desires and pursuits for your life. All of those things are good, but you got to be careful because we're all susceptible to experiencing this terrible condition of aragonia, of arrogance, where we misappropriate what God has done to ourselves and we start saying, look at what I can do. But there's another condition that we can experience, and I'm telling you, an antibiotic won't help it, but it's called repetitis. Repetitis. I should just do what I've done before. I should just do what I have done before. Hopefully, as you read what Moses says there in verse 10, you kind of get it. I mean, for one thing, we're going to cut him some slack. He's 120 years old. And you know what you can do when you're 120? Whatever you want. You know what you can say when you're 120? Whatever you want. And it seems like that's what Moses is doing, and he is letting these people have it. And we get it. He has been leading them, and he's been doing what God says for all of these years. And here we are again. These people are after me. I'm just the messenger. I don't craft the message. God does that. But you're mad at me. You're mad at Aaron. And he is furious with them. And as he's haranguing them, he gets carried away. And he takes this staff. God said to take the staff. But what's he supposed to do to the rock? Speak to the rock. What does he do? He strikes the rock. Not just once, but he does so twice. And what happens? Abundant water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. How did the people feel about this? Happy days are here again. This is wonderful. We didn't know how this was going to turn out, but now there's plenty of water for all of us. We can fill up our canteens. We can fill up our Yeti coolers. We can do all of this stuff, and we are going to be just fine. They are ecstatic. They are so happy, but God is not. And you've got to think probably Moses and Aaron are standing back and they're showed them. But what happens? The Lord says to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust me to demonstrate my holiness in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. That's formal talk for saying this. Listen, you two, you are not going to experience the promised land. You've been heading here for more than 40 years. You've been uphill and downhill. You've been wandering in the wilderness. You've been through all of this. But now you're going to get to the edge, but you're not going to go in. You got to think that Moses thought that nothing of the sort would ever happen. But now what he thought would probably never happen has become his reality. There's a sense in which all of this has been somewhat for naught. He's going to lead people to the promised land, but he's not going to be able to walk through the door. And why does God say that this has happened? He says, it's because you did not trust me. You did not trust me. Well, in what way is it that Moses and Aaron did not trust God? Well, I think on a very basic level, they didn't trust God that maybe what God said would happen, that you could speak to this and that it would produce water. So maybe it was that. But more plainly, they didn't trust that what God said to do, you should actually do. It doesn't seem that they trusted that God says to do something and it's not a suggestion. It's not conjecture and opinion. Like, you might want to think about this. But that when God actually gives instruction, that he means for us to follow that, to obey that. And if we don't, we do so at our peril. It doesn't seem that they trusted that God is serious about what he said. They had a trust problem. But think with me about this question. Yes, God calls it as he sees it, that it's a failure of trust. But why strike the rock? This staff that he's got, why hit this rock? I think it has everything to do with trust, but I think it also has something to do, in fact, everything to do with Exodus 17. You don't have to look there, but we talked about this a few weeks ago. This is not the first time that the people of God have been thirsty. Do you remember that they came to Moses, same scenario? Why didn't you just leave us in Egypt? You brought us out here to thirst to death. Man, at least if we were in Egypt, we would be alive. We wouldn't be free, and it wouldn't be great, but it'd be better than this. I'm just dying of thirst out here. And God tells Moses to take the staff and to strike the rock. God says to do that, and Moses strikes the rock. Why do you think he's striking the rock in Numbers 20? I think he's striking the rock because he struck the rock in Exodus 17. I'm just going to do what God said to do back then, and that'll be okay now. I don't need to say, or I don't need to pay attention to what God is saying to do in this moment. I'm just going to do what I did then and expect that God is going to bless it and me just like he did then. Again, penicillin will not help this. But this is repetitus in its purest form. I'm just going to do what I've done before. God blessed that then, and he'll bless it today. God called me to do that then, and so if I just do this today, maybe even with more fervor and vigor, then God's going to do something even more significant today. I consider myself reasonably handy. I'm not knocking socks off or anything, but I'm reasonably handy. I mean, good enough to fix something or break something, to fix something or electrocute myself. It could go either way. But so I'm just reasonably handy. But I can watch what somebody does and pay attention to that, learn from that, and just figure it out on my own. And so I had watched my dad years ago. This was back when we were all just commoners, and we would change our own oil. But we would do that now. Anyway. But I would see my dad do that, and it's not rocket science. It's pretty simple stuff. He'd get the ramps out, put the car up. And I always hated that. Like, I'm going to stop as we get to the top of the ramps. And so, anyway, I'd seen him do that enough where I thought, I can do this. And so I became the oil changer. And so I would change the oil in our vehicles. And I had done that repeatedly. Didn't think a whole lot of it. Did it with success. And then my sister got a new car. It was a new Toyota. I can't remember if it was new or new to her, but anyway, it seemed like to me it was time for an oil change. And so I get the ramps out, and I put the car up on the ramps, and I get my little creeper under, and I slide underneath. Oh, there's a drain plug. Put the pan underneath it. Stuff starts to go in the drain pan. It's kind of funny looking. Because typically, I don't know if you're aware of this, when you're draining oil from a car, because it's used, it looks a little dirty, kind of dark brown. This wasn't dark brown. In fact, it wasn't brown at all. It was pink. Huh. Well, I wonder what that's. Is that new? No, that's what they call the transmission. And I have just drained all the transmission fluid out of this car. Why did I do that? I'm just going to do what I did before. I'm going to go to roughly the same place underneath this car, and it's just going to be the same. And I'm going to do exactly what I've done before, and it's just going to be fine. Not paying attention that every vehicle is different, and where that is could be in a different place. I'm just going to do what I did before and expect that things are going to turn out okay. And in truth, I just drained all the transmission fluid out of the car. Individuals can do this. And I'm telling you, churches absolutely can do this. We are surrounded, and it's not a Greensboro problem. I was talking about this in Discovery just briefly today, though, but it's across the United States. There are so many churches that were once great, strong, healthy, vibrant churches that have 15 to 20 people that are huddled around trying to figure out how to keep the lights on, struggling. Why? Many of them, it's not because they haven't walked with the Lord. In fact, it's not because they're new to the faith. But many of them have walked with the Lord so long that they get afflicted by repetitis. We're just going to do what we did before. What God called us to do then, we'll just do that. We don't need to say, God, what do you want us to do now? What is it that you want us to do in this moment? What do you want to do with these people, with this community? We don't even need to ask that. We'll just do what we did then and expect that it's going to turn out. And what's going to happen is that God's not in it. He was in it when he said to do it back then, but he's telling you to do something now. Maybe it is that we need to pay attention to what the psalmist said when he said to sing to the Lord a new song. Because God understands that as time passes, people change, culture changes, demographics change. And because he knows that, he's saying, do this in that moment, in this age, in this place, in this time. And we can be so long in the tooth with respect to our faith. Well, I don't even do. We're just going to do what we did back then. And then wonder why God doesn't bless it. It is my aim as a parent that I want my children to come to know Christ at an early age and to follow him for the rest of their days. I want them to be lifelong followers of Jesus. I want them to know and walk with God a long time, because knowing and walking with God a long time is a wonderful thing. I want you to know and walk with God for a long time, because that's a wonderful thing. But you got to be on guard. You got to be careful, because there's some stuff that you're susceptible to. Aragonia will get you. Repetitis will get you. So what do you need to do? I need to decide today, what's God saying now? What does God want to do with me now? Not how did he use me then, not what stuff did God let me be a part of, but what does he want to do with me now? How does he want to use me today? Failure to do so means that what could be, what should be, whatever God's promised land for you is, won't be. Will you bow your heads with me?